places life brings us to where the darkness closes round us. There are places on our journey where we can't feel love, can't see the sun, can't hold on to our faith that everything's going to be okay. There are places where we come to an impasse, where not only are there no clear solutions, but all the solutions we try seem to just make things worse. Sometimes what brings us to those places is personal: loss, failure, illness, the mysterious combination of circumstance and brain chemistry. Sometimes it's bigger than that, and our experience of dark night of the soul, of impasse, is a part of a larger societal transformation. The ship of history these days is navigating a cold sea filled with problems big enough to sink us all. Problems that defy easy solutions, or really any solutions that we've discovered thus far. Constance Fitzgerald, in her piece Impasse and the Dark Night, from which I've read this morning, invites us to consider several of those icebergs. She writes, "If we deal with personal impasse only in the way our society teaches us, by illusion, minimization, repression, denial, apathy, we will deal with societal impasse in the same way. The no-way-out trials of our personal lives are but a part of the far more frightening situations of national and international impasse that have been formed by the social, economic, and political forces in our times. As Americans, we are not educated for impasse." Excuse me, I'm sorry. "For the experience of human limitation and darkness that will not yield to hard work, studies, statistics, rational analysis, or well-planned programs. We stand helpless, confused, and guilty before the insurmountable problems of our world. We dare not let the full import of the impasse even come to complete consciousness. It's just too painful and too destructive of national self-esteem. We cannot bear to let ourselves be totally challenged by the poor, the elderly, the unemployed, refugees, the oppressed, by the unjust, unequal situation of women in a patriarchal, sexist culture, by those tortured and imprisoned and murdered in the name of national security, by the possibility of the destruction of humanity." So what then does Fitzgerald have to offer by way of responding to these moments of impasse, these dark nights, these societal dark nights? Now keep in mind that she's a Catholic nun. Her language may require a little bit of translation here and there. But the first shift she invites us into is to understand our moments of impasse are not dead ends. They are transformational moments. She writes, "Transfiguration does not happen at the end of the road, it's in the making now. If we could see the underside of this death, we would realize it is already resurrection." So the first thing impasse requires of us is that we believe in its potential. Here's a problem. It's too big and complex to solve. Everything we try makes it worse. Rather than deciding, oh, well, we're doomed, we choose to put our faith in the human capacity for creativity. We say the fact that I can't find the answer doesn't mean there's no answer. It just means there's an answer that hasn't arrived yet. The second thing required of us is vulnerability, and I know that this is a tough one for some of us. Fitzgerald writes, "Love makes us vulnerable. And it is love itself and its development that precipitate darkness in oneself and in the other. Only when love has grown to a certain point of depth and commitment can its limitations be experienced." This is not a question of disgust, as it often appears and feels like, but of a movement through pleasure and joy to deeper, stronger faithfulness. It is the withdrawal of pleasure and the confrontation with limitation, our own and others, that signals the transition or growth crisis of the dark night. So when we're thinking about societal problems, it can be tempting to think of them as out there, to shy away from awareness of our own complicity. We might other a particular group or political party and place the blame for the mess we're in on their shoulders, and ultimately this is not helpful. Each of these societal impasses we face are in us. They're the air we breathe and the water we swim in. And transformation only comes when we're able to move past the discomfort that comes from admitting this is true, when we're able to embrace reality and own our part in it. We learn we can tell the truth about these things and survive. The third thing impasse in the dark night of the soul asks of us, according to Fitzgerald, is to embrace ambiguity. She writes, ambiguity arises on the one hand from human inadequacy, and on the other hand from the Spirit of God calling us beyond ourselves, beyond where we are, into transcendence. We're being challenged to make the passage from loving, serving, and being with because of the pleasure and joy it gives us to loving and serving regardless of the cost. So we think of Mother Teresa. We think of her as being saintly and strong in her faith. But when her writings came out, they were published posthumously, and they were very controversial in that they revealed just how much she struggled. Day in, day out, she served the poor of Calcutta, and then in the night, she felt alone and alienated and abandoned. She questioned the reality of God. She questioned her calling. So if Mother Teresa felt some ambiguity around what she was doing, surely it's okay for us to feel that too. I can't know that what I do makes a difference, and neither can you. And some days I just want to throw in the towel and let the world fall apart. So we choose to do the best we can anyway, not because we're assured of success, but because we cannot do otherwise. Which leads us to the fourth thing asked of us in times like these, which is surrender. And you thought vulnerability was hard. Fitzgerald writes, the most confusing and damnable part of the dark night is the suspicion and fear that much of the darkness is of one's own making. Since dark night is a limit experience, and since it does expose human fragility, brokenness, neurotic dependence, and lack of integration, it's understandable that it undermines a person's self-esteem and activates anxious self-analysis. The only way to break out of this desperate circle of insoluble self-questioning is to surrender in faith and trust to the unfathomable mystery that beckons onward and inward beyond calculation, order, self-justification, and fear. Fitzgerald, of course, surrenders to God, not my will, but thine be done. For those of us who struggle to believe that there's a divine plan, the question of what we are surrendering to can be a deal breaker. Having some sense of a transcendent process may be helpful. If I can't believe in God, I can choose to believe in the process of social evolution, and I can surrender to that process. I can choose to believe there's a force moving through history, pulling us away from tribalism and toward enlightenment. I can surrender to that force. Somehow accepting the fact that I'm not in charge of the universe, as much as I honestly think I would do a very good job of it if I were given the chance, is a prerequisite to being able to make a difference at all. So, if we can do these things, trust in the potential for transformation, embrace vulnerability, embrace ambiguity, and surrender to the unknown, we enter fully into the dark night. Fitzgerald writes, at the deepest levels of night, in a way one could not have imagined it could happen, one sees the withdrawal of all one has been certain of and depended upon for reassurance and affirmation. Now it is a question not of satisfaction, but of support systems that give life meaning. Concepts, systems of meaning, symbolic structures, relationships, institutions, all supports seem to fail one. And only the experience of emptiness, confusion, isolation, weakness, loneliness, and abandonment remains. In the frantic search for reassurance, one wonders if anyone, friend or spouse or God, is really trustworthy. It is the experience of this abandonment and rejection that is transforming the human person in love. This is a possession, a redemption, an actualizing, an affirmation of the person that is not understood at the time. If you've experienced it, you know what she's talking about. And if you haven't, I hope that the map she provides and that I've summarized briefly for you makes it easier when the time comes. Of course, the impasse iceberg that has my attention right now revolves around the confirmation hearings for the next Supreme Court justice, which took a gut-wrenching turn when Professor Christine Blasey Ford came forward and shared her story of being raped by the nominee in the early 80s. Below the surface on this particular impasse iceberg are the conditions that lead to rape and other forms of sexual assault and harassment in the first place. Women in this society are seen as objects. Men are bombarded with messages that the only way to be a man is to fit the mold perpetuated by toxic masculinity. Gender queer and gender fluid folks are constantly smooshed into boxes that don't fit their safety and their lives at even greater risk than any of us cisgender folk. And patriarchy insists on a rigid hierarchy, on power over rather than power with or power alongside. So what I'd like us to do is move through the steps of Dark Night together with this particular issue in mind and in heart. So let's start with trusting in the power of transformation. Can we choose to believe together that these things are rising to the surface now in the service of health and wholeness? As hard as it is, as exhausting as it is, as heartbreaking as it is to listen to story after story after story, as challenging as it is to speak our own stories, can we believe that as we listen and as we speak and as we are heard, we're healing one another and our society? Take a deep breath. Can we believe it? Can we choose to believe it? Next, we have to embrace our vulnerability. This is the water we swim in. This is the air we breathe. I was catcalled for the first time when I was 11. I was grabbed for the first time when I was 13. I was raped when I was 15. And lest you think that the problem is out there, I was raped at a Unitarian Universalist event by someone who was meant to be an adult supervisor and keep us safe. Lest you think that this was a problem back then. I know of a 13-year-old who was catcalled by grown men right here on the Palouse just a few weeks ago. So many of us, young and old, are saying, "Me too." I went back and forth. I'm back and forth. Should I ask you, the rest of you in this room, to be vulnerable in this way? Should I ask you to raise your hands, to stand? I don't know. Are you ready? Can I ask this of you? If you have been harassed, if you have been assaulted, if you have been groped against your will, if you have been raped, and if you are ready, I invite you to rise or to raise your hands. Look around. This is the world we live in. This is the water we swim in. This is the air we breathe. This is real and it is killing us, and we need you all to believe us and to stand with us. If you will support us in creating a world where this is not the state of affairs, I invite you to rise in solidarity and in compassion. That's vulnerability, folks. And it is hard, and it hurts, but it helps. And I thank you, all of you. All of you. Please be seated. I want to say just a couple things. Those of you who have been handicapped by toxic masculinity or an inadequate understanding of consent, I want you to know that redemption is possible, but only through confession and atonement. And those of you who have been damaged, I want you to know it was not your fault. You are not damaged goods. You are beautiful and whole and miraculous, every last one of you. Deep breath. So the next thing we have to do is we have to embrace ambiguity together. There are no easy answers. There's no clear path out of this mess. I don't know about you, but that curriculum that we hang our hopes on our whole lives, with its focus on teaching consent, the one that we make all of our kids go through, I have to be honest with you and tell you it's not a panacea, nor does it reach nearly enough people in this world. We're doing our best, and our best isn't good enough. I know of people who have gone through the class and still went on to cause sexual harm. The forces of patriarchy and toxic masculinity are strong, and they may win in the end. But we're going to keep on trying, not because we have any expectation of solving this problem, but simply because it's the only thing we can do. We cannot let this stand. We cannot let this continue to be the state of affairs. Right? Deep breath. And the next step is the hardest. It's time to surrender. We're not in charge. We can't protect our kids. We can't keep them from being harmed, and we can't even keep them from doing harm. We can just teach them as best we can and love them and then let them go. So surrender into that reality. Take another deep breath. And just let the enormity of this societal sickness envelop you. To me, it feels like oily heaviness. Sink into it. Stop resisting or denying or hiding and take a deep breath. And another. And another. Sink in and keep breathing until it comes. The light, the grace, the peace that passeth understanding. It takes a while. And if it doesn't come for you here this morning, that's okay too. Maybe it's not time. These things can't be forced. Above all, though, I implore you, don't be afraid of the future. Things are falling apart or dying or blowing up, and it is hard. But these are the things that need to go. These are the things that need to go. We can't predict how things will turn out. The new strategies, the new ways of being, they haven't coalesced yet. We see glimmers, we catch glimpses, but there's nothing concrete and solid we can hold on to yet. But you know what? That's okay too. That's okay too, because we have each other. We have each other. Whatever happens, we're going to be okay. Even if the ship of civilized society hits one of those icebergs and goes down, we gathered here, we have a lifeboat. And if that sinks too, we'll huddle up, we'll stick together to stay warm, and we'll swim toward the morning together. So be it, and so may it be.